The mess hall buzzed with the usual dinner conversation when Lieutenant Sarah Martinez walked in. Officers at various tables glanced up from their meals, some nodding respectfully, others whispering among themselves. Sarah had been stationed at Forward Operating Base Coast for 3 months now, but she still felt the weight of curious stares wherever she went. At 28 years old, Sarah stood 5 feet 6 inches tall with short brown hair always pulled back in regulation style. Her uniform was crisp, her posture straight, and her brown eyes held a quiet intensity that made people take notice. She wasn't the first female officer to serve at this particular base, but she was certainly one of the youngest to hold her current position as an intelligence analyst with extensive field experience. Major Tom Richardson waved her over to his table where several other officers were already seated. Tom was a large man in his 40s with graying hair and laugh lines around his eyes. He had a reputation for being friendly, but sometimes spoke before thinking things through completely. "Martinez, come join us," Tom called out cheerfully. "We were just discussing the upcoming joint operation with the Afghan forces." Sarah grabbed her tray and made her way over to the table. The other officers made room for her, and she settled in between Captain James Foster and Lieutenant Colonel David Park. The conversation continued about logistics, supply routes, and coordination with local forces. Captain Foster, a helicopter pilot with sandy hair and an easy smile, was in the middle of explaining a particularly challenging landing he had made earlier that week, when Major Richardson suddenly turned his attention to Sarah. "You know, Martinez," Tom said with a grin, "I've been meaning to ask you something. We've all heard you've seen some real action out there in the field, more than most of us actually." The table grew quieter as other officers tuned into the conversation. Sarah continued eating her dinner, neither encouraging nor discouraging the line of discussion. "What I'm curious about," Tom continued, his voice taking on what he clearly thought was a playful tone, "is your combat tally. You know, how many confirmed kills you have under your belt." The question hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Several officers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Captain Foster stopped mid-chew and looked down at his plate. Lieutenant Colonel Park raised an eyebrow and glanced at Tom with the expression that suggested he thought the major might want to reconsider his question. Sarah slowly placed her fork down and looked directly at Major Richardson. Her expression remained completely neutral, showing neither offense nor amusement at his question. The mess hall seemed to grow quieter around their table, though conversations continued at other tables throughout the large room. "Are you asking me seriously, sir?" Sarah asked in a calm, measured tone. Tom's grin faltered slightly, but he pressed on, apparently not reading the room correctly. "Well, yeah. I mean, we've all heard stories about your deployments. 3 tours, right? Afghanistan, Iraq, and back to Afghanistan again. Word is you've been in some pretty intense situations." Other officers at the table exchanged glances. Captain Foster cleared his throat softly, as if trying to signal to Tom that he might want to drop the subject. But Major Richardson seemed oblivious to the growing tension. "Come on, Martinez," Tom said, his voice still carrying that jovial tone. "We're all military here. It's not like it's classified information or anything. Just curious about your experience level." Sarah picked up her water glass and took a slow sip, her eyes never leaving Tom's face. The silence stretched for what felt like minutes but was probably only seconds. When she set the glass down, she folded her hands in front of her on the table. 14, she said simply. The word dropped into the conversation like a stone into still water, creating ripples of silence that spread outward. Tom's grin disappeared completely. Captain Foster stopped eating altogether. Lieutenant Colonel Park leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression growing more serious. 14 what? Tom asked, though his voice had lost all of its previous lightness. 14 confirmed kills, Sarah replied in the same calm, matter-of-fact tone she might have used to discuss the weather. "You asked for my combat tally. That's my combat tally." The silence that followed was deafening. Other conversations at nearby tables seemed to fade into background noise as the officers at their table processed what they had just heard. Major Richardson's face had gone pale, and he appeared to be struggling to find words. Sarah continued eating her dinner as if nothing unusual had happened. She cut her chicken with precise movements, chewed thoughtfully, and occasionally took sips of her water. Her demeanor remained completely unchanged, as if discussing confirmed kills was as routine as discussing the day's training schedule. Captain Foster was the first to break the silence. 14, he repeated quietly, more to himself than to anyone else. That's... Tom started to say something but seemed to lose his train of thought halfway through the sentence. Lieutenant Colonel Park, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke up. That's a significant number, Lieutenant, he said respectfully. Sarah looked up from her meal and nodded slightly. Yes, sir, it is. The weight of her simple acknowledgement settled over the table like a heavy blanket. These were all experienced military officers, men who had seen combat themselves and understood what those numbers meant. They weren't just statistics or tallies to be discussed casually over dinner. Each number represented a life taken, a decision made in a split second under extreme circumstances, a moment that would stay with someone forever. Major Richardson finally seemed to understand the gravity of what he had asked and the significance of the answer he had received. His jovial demeanor had completely evaporated, replaced by a soberness that matched the mood at the table. I apologize, Martinez, Tom said quietly. I shouldn't have asked that question so casually. Sarah looked at him directly, her expression still calm and composed. You asked a question, sir. I answered it. No need to apologize for being curious about a fellow officer's experience. But even as she spoke those words, everyone at the table could sense that something had shifted. The casual dinner conversation had taken a turn into serious territory, and there was no going back to the light-hearted banter they had been enjoying just minutes before. Word spread quickly through the base as it always did in the confined environment of a military installation. By the next morning, Sarah's calm revelation had made its way through various units and departments. Some stories were accurate, others were embellished, but the core fact remained the same. Lieutenant Sarah Martinez had 14 confirmed kills, and she had stated it as simply as if she were giving the time of day. Sarah arrived at the intelligence briefing room early, as was her habit. She preferred to review the overnight reports and prepare her analysis before the other officers arrived. The room was quiet except for the hum of computers and the distant sound of helicopters taking off from the landing pad outside. Captain Foster entered the room about 10 minutes later. Carrying a steaming cup of coffee and looking somewhat uncomfortable, he nodded to Sarah and took his usual seat across from her workstation, but seemed to be struggling with whether or not to say something. Good morning, Captain, Sarah said without looking up from her computer screen. Morning, Martinez, he replied, then paused. Listen, about last night. Sarah finally looked up from her work. What about last night, sir? James Foster was a good pilot and a decent man, but he had never been particularly good with difficult conversations. He shifted in his chair and took a sip of his coffee before continuing. Tom Richardson is a good guy, but sometimes he doesn't think before he speaks, James said carefully. I just wanted you to know that none of us think less of you for your experience level. Sarah's expression remained neutral. I appreciate that, Captain, but I'm not concerned about what people think of my service record. Right, of course, James said quickly. I just meant that we all respect what you've done for your country. 14. That's a lot to carry. The way he said the number with a kind of reverent heaviness made Sarah pause in her work. She had heard that tone before, usually from people who had never been in combat themselves but had romantic notions about what it meant to take a life in war. It's not something I carry, sir, Sarah said quietly. It's something I did. There's a difference. Before Captain Foster could respond, Lieutenant Colonel Park entered the room along with several other officers for the morning briefing. The conversation ended, but James continued to glance at Sarah throughout the meeting with a mixture of curiosity and something that might have been awe. The briefing proceeded normally, covering intelligence reports from various sectors, upcoming operations, and coordination with Afghan forces. Sarah presented her analysis of recent insurgent activity in the region, with her usual professionalism and attention to detail. Her colleagues listened attentively and asked relevant questions, but there was an underlying tension in the room that hadn't been there before. After the meeting, as officers were filing out, Lieutenant Colonel Park approached Sarah's workstation. Martinez, could I have a word with you? He asked. Of course, sir. Park waited until the room was empty before speaking. He was a career military man in his late 40s, with silver hair and the kind of steady presence that came from years of command experience. He had seen combat himself and understood the realities of war better than most. I wanted to discuss what happened last night. he said, pulling up a chair next to her desk. Not to criticize you, but to make sure you're doing okay. Sarah looked at him with a slight tilt of her head. I'm fine, sir. Why would you think otherwise? Because I've been in this business for over 20 years. And I know that the number you shared last night represents more than just statistics, Park said gently. Each one of those encounters was a situation where you had to make a life or death decision, often in a matter of seconds. That kind of responsibility takes a toll on even the strongest people. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful but still maintained that same calm quality that had characterized her response the night before. With respect, sir, I think people sometimes make it more complicated than it needs to be, she said. In each of those situations, I did what I was trained to do. I eliminated threats to protect myself and my fellow soldiers. It wasn't personal, and it wasn't about taking lives for the sake of taking lives. It was about completing the mission and bringing everyone home safely. Lieutenant Colonel Park nodded slowly. That's a very rational way to look at it, and you're not wrong. But I've also seen soldiers who thought they could compartmentalize everything perfectly, only to have it catch up with them later. I appreciate your concern, sir, but I've been through all the appropriate counseling and psychological evaluations, Sarah replied. I'm not avoiding or suppressing anything. I'm simply not allowing myself to be defined by those moments. Park studied her face for a few seconds, looking for signs of stress or emotional strain. What he saw was a young woman who appeared remarkably composed and self-aware. But he also recognized that the most dangerous psychological wounds were often the ones that didn't show on the surface. Have you talked to anyone about how people are reacting to what you shared last night? He asked. Sarah's eyebrows rose slightly. Are people reacting in some particular way? Well, you've become something of a topic of conversation, Park said carefully. Some people are impressed, some are intimidated, and some are just curious about your story. None of that is necessarily bad, but it can create expectations and assumptions that might not be entirely fair to you. Sarah turned back to her computer and pulled up a new report. People can think whatever they want to think, sir. My job is to analyze intelligence and provide accurate assessments to support our operations. Everything else is just noise. Lieutenant Colonel Park recognized the dismissal in her tone, but he also heard something else. A weariness that suggested she had dealt with people's reactions to her combat experience before. Just remember that you don't owe anyone explanations about your service, he said as he stood to leave. And if you ever need to talk to someone who understands what you've been through, my door is always open. Thank you, sir. I'll keep that in mind. As Park left the room, Sarah continued working on her reports, but she could feel the subtle shift in how people interacted with her throughout the day. Conversations became a little more formal, glances lasted a little longer, and there was a new kind of space that people seemed to maintain around her. It wasn't fear exactly, but it was definitely a form of respect mixed with uncertainty about how to relate to someone who had seen and done things that most of them had only heard about in stories. 3 days after the mess hall incident, Sarah found herself assigned to accompany a patrol into a village about 15 kilometers from the base. Intelligence reports suggested increased insurgent activity in the area, and her expertise in threat assessment made her a valuable addition to the mission. The patrol consisted of 12 soldiers led by Sergeant First Class Miguel Santos, a veteran with 2 previous deployments, who had heard about Sarah's revelation, but treated her with the same professional respect he showed all officers. The soldiers, under his command, however, seemed to regard her with a mixture of curiosity and nervous energy. As they loaded into the armored vehicles, Sarah overheard snippets of conversation among the younger soldiers. Private Johnson, barely 20 years old and on his first deployment, whispered to his buddy about that lieutenant with 14 kills. Another soldier wondered aloud if she was as dangerous as people were saying. Sarah ignored the chatter and focused on reviewing the mission briefings and intelligence reports. The village they were visiting had been experiencing problems with insurgents demanding tribute from local farmers. The patrol's job was to meet with village elders, assess the situation, and determine what kind of support might be needed. The convoy moved through the Afghan countryside under a bright morning sun. The landscape was beautiful in its harsh way, with rocky hills and sparse vegetation stretching to the horizon. Sarah had learned to appreciate these moments of relative calm during her deployments, knowing how quickly situations could change. Sergeant Santos rode in the same vehicle as Sarah, and about halfway to their destination, he finally addressed the elephant in the room. "Ma'am, I hope you don't mind me asking, but is it true what people are saying about your combat experience?" he asked respectfully. Sarah looked at him directly. "What exactly are people saying, Sergeant?" "Well, word is you've got 14 confirmed kills and that you said it like you were talking about the weather," Santos replied. "Some of the younger guys are pretty impressed. Some of the older ones are wondering what kind of situations you were in to rack up numbers like that." Sarah was quiet for a moment, watching the landscape pass by through the vehicle's small window. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful. "The situations I was in were the kind where people die if you hesitate," she said simply. "I didn't seek out those encounters, Sergeant. They found me." Santos nodded slowly. He had enough experience to understand what she meant without needing detailed explanations. "Can I ask you something else, ma'am?" he said. "Go ahead. How do you deal with it? The weight of it, I mean. I've got 3 confirmed kills myself, and sometimes I still think about those guys. Wonder if they had families, you know?" Sarah turned to look at him more directly. This was the first time since the mess hall incident that someone had asked her a genuine, thoughtful question about her experience, rather than just expressing curiosity or awe. "I think about them too," she said quietly. "All of them. But I also remember the circumstances that led to those moments. In every case, it was them or us. If I had hesitated, if I had second-guessed myself, good soldiers would have died instead." "That's a heavy responsibility," Santos observed. "Yes, it is. But that's what we signed up for, isn't it? To make the hard decisions so that other people don't have to." Their conversation was interrupted by the radio crackling to life. The lead vehicle was reporting movement in the hills ahead, and the convoy slowed to a more cautious pace. Sarah immediately shifted into operational mode, scanning the terrain and reviewing her mental map of the area. When they reached the village, the meeting with the elders proceeded smoothly. Sarah's role was primarily to observe and assess, noting details about the village's layout, the demeanor of the residents, and any signs of insurgent presence or intimidation. The village elder, a weathered man named Ahmad who spoke decent English, described how armed men had been coming to the village demanding money and supplies. He seemed nervous but willing to talk, especially when Sergeant Santos assured him that the American forces were there to help, not to cause problems. During the meeting, Sarah noticed several things that didn't appear in the initial intelligence reports. There were fresh tire tracks near the village center that suggested recent vehicle traffic, and some of the younger men in the village seemed unusually tense when the soldiers were around. As the patrol was preparing to leave, Sarah approached Sergeant Santos with her observations. "Sergeant, I think we need to be extra cautious on the way back," she said quietly. "Something doesn't feel right here." Santos trusted her instincts. He had learned over the years that good soldiers developed a sixth sense about dangerous situations, and everything he had heard about Sarah suggested she was very good at her job. "What are you thinking, ma'am?" he asked. "The villagers are scared, but not just of the insurgents," Sarah explained. "Some of them seem nervous about us being here, like they're worried about retaliation for talking to us. And those tire tracks suggest someone with vehicles has been using this village as a stopping point." Santos nodded and quietly passed word to the other vehicle commanders to be on high alert for the return journey. As they loaded back into their vehicles, Sarah continued scanning the surrounding hills and noting potential ambush points along their route. About 3 kilometers from the village, her vigilance paid off. She spotted the glint of sunlight reflecting off something metallic in the rocks above the road ahead. "Contact front," she called out calmly into her radio. "Possible sniper position in the rocks, 2 o'clock, approximately 400 meters. The convoy immediately stopped and soldiers deployed into defensive positions. Through her binoculars, Sarah could see at least 2 figures moving among the rocks and what appeared to be the barrel of a rifle. Sergeant Santos called for air support and requested permission to engage, but Sarah was already calculating angles and distances. She had her M4 rifle ready and was settling into a shooting position behind their vehicle. "I have a clear shot on the primary target," she reported to Santos. "Take it," he replied without hesitation. Sarah's rifle cracked once and one of the figures in the rocks dropped immediately. The second insurgent fired wildly in their direction before disappearing deeper into the rocky terrain. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes, but it demonstrated everything that Sarah's colleagues had been hearing about her capabilities. Her shot had been precise, immediate, and decisive. There was no hesitation, no apparent emotional reaction, just professional competence under pressure. As helicopter support arrived to clear the remaining insurgents from the area, Private Johnson approached Sarah with an expression of amazement. "Ma'am, that was incredible," he said. "How did you even see them up there?" Sarah was already cleaning her rifle and preparing for the continuation of their journey back to base. "Experience, Private," she said simply, "and paying attention to details." The successful patrol and Sarah's precision shooting became the talk of the base within hours of their return. What had started as curiosity about her combat record had now transformed into something approaching legend status among the enlisted, personnel, and younger officers. Major Richardson found himself in an uncomfortable position. His casual question in the mess hall had inadvertently created a situation where one of his officers had become the subject of intense scrutiny and speculation. He decided he needed to have a private conversation with Sarah to address the situation. He found her in the intelligence office that evening, working late as usual on threat assessments and operational planning. The office was quiet except for the soft hum of computers and the distant sounds of base activities winding down for the night. "Martinez, do you have a few minutes?" Tom asked, his tone much more serious than it had been during their previous interaction. Sarah looked up from her work and gestured to the chair across from her desk. "Of course, sir. What can I do for you?" Tom sat down and was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to find the right words. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of genuine regret. "I owe you an apology," he said. "My question the other night was inappropriate, and I've created a situation that I don't think is fair to you." Sarah leaned back in her chair and studied his face. "How so, sir?" "Well, for starters, I asked you a personal question about your combat experience in front of other officers, which put you in a position where you had to either answer or appear evasive," Tom explained. "And now, because of your answer and what happened on patrol today, you've become something of a celebrity around here. People are treating you like you're some kind of military superhero." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, considering his words. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful but not defensive. "Major, with respect, I think you're giving yourself too much credit for people's reactions," she said. "I chose to answer your question honestly because I don't believe in hiding from my service record. If people want to make assumptions or create stories based on that information, that's their choice." Tom shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "But don't you think all this attention might affect your ability to do your job effectively? Or create unrealistic expectations about your capabilities?" Sarah's expression grew slightly more serious. "Are you questioning my professional competence, sir?" "No, not at all," Tom said quickly. "Your work is excellent, and what you did on patrol today probably saved lives. I'm just concerned about the pressure this kind of attention might create." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their evening routines. When she turned back to face Tom, her demeanor was calm but firm. "Major, I've been dealing with people's reactions to my combat record for 3 years now," she said. "Some people are impressed, some are intimidated, some are curious, and some are skeptical. None of that changes what happened during my deployments, and none of it affects my ability to do my current job." Tom nodded, but he still looked troubled. "I guess what I'm really asking is whether you're okay with all of this. The questions, the attention, the way people look at you now." Sarah returned to her seat and looked directly at him. "Can I tell you something about those 14 kills, Major?" Tom nodded, sensing that she was about to share something important. "The first one happened during my second week in Afghanistan on my first deployment," Sarah began, her voice taking on a more personal tone than Tom had heard from her before. "I was 23 years old, fresh out of officer training, and absolutely terrified. We were on a convoy that got hit by an improvised explosive device, and in the chaos that followed, an insurgent came around the corner of a building with an AK-47. She paused, looking down at her hands for a moment before continuing. "I had maybe 2 seconds to decide what to do. My training kicked in and I fired. The insurgent went down, and later we found out he was maybe 16 years old. Not much younger than some of the soldiers I was supposed to be leading." Tom remained silent, recognizing that she was sharing something deeply personal. "That night, I couldn't sleep," Sarah continued. "I kept thinking about that kid, wondering what his story was, whether he had been forced into fighting or had chosen it. I called my father, who's a retired Marine, and asked him how he dealt with similar situations during his deployments. "What did he tell you?" Tom asked quietly. "He said that the hardest part about being a soldier isn't learning how to take a life when necessary. It's learning how to live with yourself afterward, while still being able to do your job effectively," Sarah replied. "He told me that the moment I stopped caring about those decisions would be the moment I stopped being the kind of soldier that America needed." Sarah stood up again and walked back to the window. "Every one of those 14 kills represents a moment when I had to make a split-second decision to protect myself or my fellow soldiers. I remember each situation clearly, and I've thought about each one extensively. But I refuse to let guilt or regret paralyze me when similar situations arise." Tom was beginning to understand that his concerns about Sarah's emotional state might have been misplaced. The young woman in front of him wasn't someone who had become callous or detached from the reality of combat. Instead, she seemed to have found a way to process and integrate her experiences while maintaining her operational effectiveness. "That's a remarkably mature perspective," Tom said with genuine respect. "It's a necessary perspective," Sarah corrected, "because the alternative is to either become ineffective as a soldier or to become the kind of person who enjoys killing. Neither of those options is acceptable to me." Tom stood up to leave but paused at the door. "Martinez, I want you to know that after today's patrol, Sergeant Santos had nothing but praise for your performance. He said you probably saved several lives with your situational awareness and marksmanship." Sarah nodded acknowledgement, but didn't seem particularly surprised by the praise. "That's 15, she said quietly. Tom looked confused. 15 what?" "Confirmed kills. The sniper today makes 15. The matter-of-fact way she stated this new number had the same impact as her original revelation. Tom realized that for Sarah, updating her combat tally wasn't about keeping score or taking pride in killing. It was simply about maintaining an accurate record of her military service. "I'll make sure that gets included in your after-action report," Tom said, his voice carrying new respect and understanding. After he left, Sarah returned to her work, but she found herself thinking about the conversation. She appreciated Major Richardson's concern, even if she felt it was somewhat misplaced. She understood that people had difficulty reconciling her calm demeanor with her combat record, but she had learned long ago that other people's comfort with her experiences wasn't her responsibility. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her father back in Texas. It was a simple message. "Heard through the grapevine that you're making headlines again. Remember what we talked about. Proud of you. Stay safe." Sarah smiled slightly and typed back, "Always do, Dad. Love you too." 2 weeks had passed since the patrol incident, and Sarah had settled into a routine that felt both familiar and strange. The base had adapted to her presence in the way that military installations always did, when something unusual became routine. People still glanced at her with interest, but the intense curiosity had faded into a more manageable level of respect and professional acknowledgement. Captain Foster had become something of an unofficial liaison between Sarah and some of the younger officers who were curious about her experiences but too intimidated to approach her directly. He found her in the base's small gym one evening, methodically working through a strength training routine. "Mind if I join you?" James asked, gesturing to the weight bench next to where Sarah was doing pull-ups. "Not at all," Sarah replied, dropping down from the bar and reaching for her water bottle. They worked out in comfortable silence for a few minutes before James brought up what was clearly on his mind. "Some of the lieutenants have been asking me about you," he said while adjusting the weights on his barbell. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "What kind of questions?" "Mostly about how you got to be so composed under pressure," James explained. "Lieutenant Willis was particularly curious. He's been in a couple of firefights now, and he says he still gets shaky afterward. He wants to know how you manage to stay so calm." Sarah considered this while adjusting her own equipment. Lieutenant Kevin Willis was 24 years old, a recent West Point graduate who had arrived at the base about a month after Sarah. He was intelligent and eager, but still learning how to process the realities of combat. "What did you tell him?" Sarah asked. "That he should probably ask you himself," James replied with a slight grin. "But he's too nervous to approach you directly. I think he's worried you might think less of him for having normal human reactions to getting shot at." Sarah stopped what she was doing and looked at James directly. Is that really what people think? That I don't have normal human reactions? James paused in his workout, recognizing that he might have inadvertently touched on something important. Well, you have to admit, Martinez, your responses to stressful situations are pretty different from most people's, he said carefully. When you told Richardson about your kill count, you said it like you were giving him directions to the commissary. And during the patrol, Santos said you spotted that sniper and took the shot like it was just another day at the office. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, processing what James had said. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful rather than defensive. Can I tell you something about that patrol? She asked. Of course. After I took that shot, my hands were shaking so badly I could barely reload my rifle, Sarah said quietly. My heart was pounding, my mouth was dry, and I had to concentrate on controlling my breathing to keep from hyperventilating. James looked surprised. Really? You seemed completely calm. I was calm on the outside because that's what the situation required, Sarah explained. But on the inside, I was having the same physiological reactions that anyone would have after taking someone's life. The difference is that I've learned how to function effectively despite those reactions. She sat down on a nearby bench and continued. The first time I killed someone, I threw up afterward. The second time, I cried. By the fifth or sixth time, I had learned that I could have those emotional and physical reactions without letting them interfere with my ability to do my job. James sat down across from her, clearly interested in what she was sharing. How did you learn that? He asked. Practice mostly, Sarah replied. And accepting that feeling scared or shaky or sick after a firefight doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. The goal isn't to stop having those reactions. The goal is to not let them get you or your teammates killed. James nodded slowly. So you're saying that Willis shouldn't be worried about getting shaky after a firefight? I'm saying that Willis should be more worried if he stops getting shaky after firefights, Sarah corrected. The day you stop having an emotional reaction to taking someone's life is the day you need to seriously reconsider whether you should be carrying a weapon. Their conversation was interrupted by Lieutenant Willis himself, who appeared in the gym doorway looking slightly uncertain. Oh, sorry, Kevin said, clearly not expecting to find Sarah there. I didn't mean to interrupt. You're not interrupting, Sarah said, standing up. James was just telling me that you had some questions about combat stress management. Kevin's face reddened slightly, but he stepped into the gym. Well, I mean, if you don't mind me asking. I don't mind, Sarah said simply. What would you like to know? Kevin looked between Sarah and James, clearly trying to work up the courage to ask his question directly. I guess I'm wondering how you managed to stay so professional during and after combat situations, he said finally. When we got hit last week, I was okay during the firefight, but afterward I couldn't stop my hands from shaking. It was embarrassing. Sarah studied his face for a moment, seeing something of her younger self in his expression. Lieutenant, can I ask you something? She said. Sure. During that firefight, did you return fire effectively? Yes, ma'am. Did you follow your training and maintain good communication with your team? I think so, yes. Did anyone in your unit get hurt because you failed to do your job? No, ma'am, Sarah nodded. Then the fact that your hands were shaking afterward is completely irrelevant. Your body was processing the stress of a life-threatening situation. That's normal and healthy. Kevin looked somewhat relieved but still uncertain. But you always seem so composed. People say you never lose your cool. Sarah almost smiled at that. Lieutenant, 3 months ago I had a panic attack in a supply closet after a particularly difficult intelligence briefing. Last year during my previous deployment, I spent an entire night unable to sleep because I kept replaying a firefight in my head, wondering if I could have resolved it without killing anyone. Both James and Kevin looked surprised by these admissions. The difference between me and you isn't that I don't have stress reactions, Sarah continued. It's that I've learned not to let other people see them when it would undermine unit morale or operational effectiveness. But that doesn't mean they don't happen. Kevin was quiet for a moment, processing this information. So you're saying it's okay to have those reactions, but I need to learn when and where to have them? Exactly, Sarah replied. During a firefight, your priority is staying alive and keeping your teammates alive. Everything else can wait. But afterward, if you need to shake or cry or throw up or call your mom, that's perfectly normal and you shouldn't be ashamed of it. James leaned forward in his chair. Is that something they taught you or did you figure it out on your own? Bit of both, Sarah said. The Army provides training on combat stress management, but a lot of it you have to learn through experience. And by talking to other soldiers who've been through similar situations, she looked directly at Kevin. The most important thing to remember is that having emotional reactions to combat doesn't make you weak or unsuited for military service. It makes you human. And humans who care about what they're doing and who they're protecting make better soldiers than robots who feel nothing. 3 months after the mess hall incident that had started everything, Sarah received orders for her next assignment. She would be rotating back to the United States to take a position at the Pentagon, working in intelligence analysis and training development. The news spread through the base with the same efficiency that military gossip always traveled. Major Richardson found her packing up her office on her final afternoon at Forward Operating Base Coast. The intelligence office looked strange with her personal items removed and her files boxed up for transfer to her replacement. Congratulations on the Pentagon assignment, Tom said, leaning against the doorframe. That's a significant career advancement. Sarah looked up from the box she was packing and smiled slightly. Thank you, sir. I'm looking forward to the new challenges. Tom entered the office and sat down in the chair across from her desk. The same chair where they had had their serious conversation weeks earlier. You know, Martinez, I've been thinking a lot about that night in the mess hall, he said. About my question and your answer. Sarah paused in her packing and gave him her full attention. I realized that I asked you that question because I was curious about what makes someone like you different from someone like me, Tom continued. I had this idea that people with extensive combat experience must be fundamentally different somehow. Harder maybe, or less emotional. Sarah sat down across from him, interested to hear where he was going with this. But watching you work these past few months, talking to other officers about their interactions with you, I've come to understand that the difference isn't in how much you feel, Tom said. It's in how you've learned to use those feelings constructively instead of letting them paralyze you. Sarah nodded slowly. That's a fair assessment, sir. I also realized that my casual question about your kill count was really a way of trying to reduce your experience to something simple and quantifiable, Tom admitted. As if the number of people you've killed in combat tells the whole story of who you are as a soldier or as a person. Sarah was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully before responding. Major, can I share something with you? She asked. Of course. That number, 15 confirmed kills, represents the worst moments of my military career, Sarah said quietly. Not because I regret the decisions I made, but because each one represents a situation where diplomacy, deterrence, and non-lethal solutions all failed. Each one means that someone died who might have lived if circumstances had been different. Tom leaned forward, clearly understanding that she was sharing something deeply personal, but those same 15 kills also represent moments when I successfully protected my fellow soldiers and completed my mission, Sarah continued. They represent training, discipline, and decision-making under the worst possible circumstances. They represent my commitment to bringing my teammates home safely. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base where soldiers were going about their daily routines. The number itself doesn't make me a hero or a monster, she said. It's just data. What matters is the context around each of those decisions and how I've chosen to integrate those experiences into who I am as a soldier and as a person. Tom stood up as well, preparing to leave her to finish her packing. You know, the younger officers talk about you differently now than they did when you first arrived, he said. How so? When you first got here, they were intimidated by your reputation and curious about your experience, Tom explained. Now they talk about you as someone they can learn from, someone who's been through difficult situations and come out stronger and wiser. Sarah turned back to face him. That's probably the best compliment anyone could give a military officer. Lieutenant Willis told me that your conversation with him in the gym completely changed how he thinks about combat stress, Tom added. He said you made him realize that having emotional reactions doesn't make him weak, it makes him human. Sarah smiled at that. Lieutenant Willis is going to be a good officer. He cares about his soldiers and takes his responsibilities seriously. Those are the qualities that matter most. Tom extended his hand for a handshake. It's been an honor serving with you, Martinez. Good luck at the Pentagon. Thank you, sir. It's been an honor serving with you as well. After Tom left, Sarah finished packing her remaining items. As she was closing the last box, Captain Foster appeared in the doorway. Got a minute for one last conversation? James asked. Of course. James sat down and was quiet for a moment, clearly trying to organize his thoughts. I wanted to thank you for something, he said finally. What's that? For showing all of us that it's possible to be both strong and human at the same time, James explained. Before you arrived, I think a lot of us had this idea that truly effective soldiers had to be emotionally detached or somehow less affected by what they experience in combat. Sarah leaned against her desk and listened, watching you work, seeing how you handle stress and make decisions, talking to you about your experiences. It made me realize that the best soldiers aren't the ones who don't feel anything. James continued. They're the ones who feel everything and find ways to use those emotions to make themselves better at protecting others. Sarah was touched by his words, but also slightly uncomfortable with the praise. Captain, I hope you understand that I'm not some kind of perfect example, she said. I've made mistakes, had bad days, struggled with doubt and fear just like everyone else. That's exactly what makes you a good example, James replied. You're human, but you're human in a way that makes you more effective, not less. As the afternoon wore on, other officers and enlisted personnel stopped by to say goodbye. Sergeant Santos brought her a small Afghan rug that his unit had purchased from local artisans. Lieutenant Willis gave her a handwritten note thanking her for her advice and mentorship. Even some of the soldiers who had only interacted with her briefly made a point of wishing her well in her new assignment. That evening, Sarah found herself back in the mess hall where everything had started. The room was busy with dinner conversation, just as it had been 3 months earlier. She sat at the same table where Major Richardson had asked his casual question about her combat tally. Looking around the room, Sarah reflected on how much had changed since that night. She had arrived at this base as just another officer with an impressive service record. She was leaving as someone who had inadvertently become a mentor and example for younger soldiers trying to understand how to process their own combat experiences. The irony wasn't lost on her that a casual question asked as a joke had led to some of the most meaningful conversations about military service and personal growth that she had experienced in her career. As she finished her dinner, Sarah thought about the young lieutenant who would be arriving next week to take over her position. She hoped that officer would find the same supportive community of colleagues that she had discovered here, and that they would have the opportunity to both learn from others and share their own experiences. The number 15 would always be part of her service record, but Sarah now understood more clearly that it was just one piece of a much larger story about duty, sacrifice, growth, and the ongoing challenge of serving with honor while remaining fundamentally human. She stood up, cleared her tray, and walked out of the mess hall toward her quarters to prepare for the journey home, carrying with her the knowledge that sometimes the most important conversations begin with the most unexpected questions.